Okay, day 17, section 2. So let's talk about some of the details of the Chinese banking system, and specifically these big four banks. Right. So the Chinese banking system. First off, China has a huge amount of domestic savings, right? In part because most of the economic incentives in China are to save, and in part because you know people older than 50 have remembered very very troubling economic times, including the Communist Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, in which roughly 30 million people starved to death. That will make you very big savers, right? When you go through tough times like that, you become a country of savers. And so that, coupled with a lot of economic incentives created by the government, means it's a country that's got all this savings, right? And people have very few places to put some of this savings. A lot of it ends up in Chinese banks. What do the Chinese banks then do with it? They invest in public capital, meaning they fund some of this to the government and some of it indirectly through the government to these state-owned enterprises. All right, so that's the basics of the formal Chinese financial system. So the big four banks in China own about 70% of all the financial assets in China. That's just an astonishingly big number. These banks are also the biggest owners of equity in China. A lot of this equity is from state-owned companies who actually have equity that trades. Not all of it. The government remains to be the primary owner of these companies, but some of these companies are publicly traded. What you're getting with those shares of stock, who knows, right? Because ultimately the government is in control, but you're getting something. You're getting maybe dividends, and a lot of these equity is held by banks in China. That's something that U.S. banks are not allowed to do. These Chinese banks also own 70% of all Chinese bonds. So these banks just basically run the Chinese financial system. Now, in some sense, China seems to think, well, these big banks mean they're safe. They're safe. They won't fail, right? They can't fail. According to the Chinese government, non-performing loans, right? NPLs are non-performing loans, meaning basically loans that that people are not servicing, that people are not making their payments on. They have fallen from 12.5% back in 2005 to less than 1% today. This is what the Chinese government says. At the same time, the loans outstanding have tripled. So the Chinese government wants us to understand that the loans in the Chinese financial system tripled while the non-performing loans fell by a factor of 12. Unlikely, right? Unlikely. And you'll hear me use the word unlikely a lot today, because most of the statistics from the Chinese financial system, I don't really think you can quite believe, right? You just can't believe, right? We don't believe this because one of the things is we know that most of these loans, a huge chunk of these loans, go to state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises only produce about a third of GDP today in China, but they receive 2/3 of the credit, 2/3 of the lending, right? That doesn't seem to be a scenario for making these banks very profitable. If most of their lending is going to a very small part of the economy, a part of the economy that we know is not growing very fast. The profit motive for lending is very weak. As I said before, most of these loans are not based on profits. They're based on relationships, right? The Communist Party wants me to do that. So I will make the loan, not because it's profitable, but because I need to do it to satisfy my local Communist Party member. So in many ways, what you have here is the people who work in these banks don't really work for the banks as much as they work for China Incorporated, right? They're really working for the country and the government, the Communist Party of China, much more so than they are actually working for banks and their shareholders. Just to give you some idea about doing business in China, this is looking at a ranking by the World Bank called Doing Business in China. And this really looks at a whole bunch of different measures of how easy it is to do business. And so here, a lower number it means better. It's easier to do business. And this is along a whole wide ranking of, of things. Here's the overall ranking. And you notice that China is only, oops, sorry about that. China is only 79th in the world in terms of the ease of doing business, in part because so much of what is involved in starting a business is difficult in China. Starting a business in China is very difficult, 151th in the world. Why? Most likely because you're going to have to bribe an official. Registering property, right? Making sure that you have legal title to your property. China is a little bit better there. Getting credit, China's pretty bad, 65th in the world. Why? Because these big banks really don't lend to small businesses. They only lend to the big SOEs. Protecting investors, right? So in other words, if I buy a share of stock or if I buy a bond and the company defaults, can I actually get my money back, or can I get some of my money back? China does a little bit better about enforcing contracts, but they do not so good about closing a business. Closing a business means if I have a company that goes bankrupt, can I actually go through Chapter 11 and, wind down my business in a responsible way? Oftentimes the rules of doing that in China are not clear. And then finally here, you just have overall corruption. And you notice that China is just very high in overall corruption, right? The corruption in China is not the kind of corruption it's not the kind of corruption that you see on the streets every single day, right? Like, for instance, most people in China do not see corruption in their daily lives, right? A cop is not going to stop you and ask you for money. But if you go and engage with the government, right, you need something from the government, chances are you're going to come across somebody who's going to ask you for something, right? And these asks can be quite significant, right? Quite significant. And so whenever you go to a government, you have to really wonder what's the true price you're going to end up paying. This is a police station, right? And I always kind of thought this sign was funny. Here's the Chinese symbols for it, and then it's translated into complaints acceptance. And when I was looking at this, I couldn't understand if this means this is the place where your complaints are accepted by the police, or this is where you have to gain acceptance that your complaints are not going to be heard, right? Right? I mean, in other words, it doesn't say complaints dealt with, it says complaints accepted. And in many ways, I think that's how most people feel about the Chinese government and the Chinese police is, yeah, the government will hear your complaints all you want. They're not going to do anything about it if it's not in the government's self-interest, right? And so you're better just to stay away from the government. And I think that's truly how most individuals who run their own companies feel, is that the government is just something you try to avoid, right? It's not something that helps. It's only something that can hurt. If you look outside of China for numbers, what some estimates say is that actually, if you look at the true number of non-performing loans, it's not 1% like the Chinese government says. It's more 8 to 12%, which, if this was actually true, would mean that that's almost all the that's almost all the equity in the banking system. Almost all the equity in the banking system. So in other words, many of these Chinese banks would be insolvent if these loans were actually allowed to default. Between 2004 and 2008, new capital into the system is equal to the total dividends distributed by the Chinese banks. So in other words, capital was coming in, but it was just paying dividends out. It's almost like a Ponzi scheme, right? Money coming in, paying those who already invested in. What's the true risk of these? It's really impossible to gauge. We have no idea about what the risk or the leverage of most Chinese banks are. We know it's highly leveraged, but we don't know how great it is. And then there's always this question of, what does the government back? Does the government back every crazy loan that these banks make? Quite possibly. But if so, that means there's a lot of moral hazard in these banks. There's a lot of moral hazard there. So that's a brief description of Chinese banks. Let's talk about the ways in which Chinese banks are financially repressed, right? Do that in a moment.